The house was a geography I knew by heart. I grew up in it after all. I knew the specific floorboard on the second floor landing that always groaned, the way the pipes in the wall would shudder when the heat kicked on, the exact pitch of the wind whistling through the old window frames on a stormy night. It was my parents' house, a standard 2-story suburban home on a quiet, tree-lined street. And for that week, it was all mine. My parents were on an anniversary trip, leaving me a 20-year-old college student on winter break in charge. I was looking forward to the solitude, no curfews, no chores, just quiet nights for studying and late-night video games. That night started like any other. It was just after 1 a.m. A fresh layer of snow had fallen, blanketing the world outside in a thick, sound-dampening silence. The only noise was the gentle hum of my computer and the soft clicking of my keyboard as I tried to finish a paper I'd been putting off. My bedroom was on the second floor, and my desk faced the wall, but the door was open to my left, leading out into the dark hallway. The only light in the entire upstairs was the warm, yellow glow from my desk lamp, which cast a pool of light on my books and spilled out into the hall, painting long, distorted shadows against the opposite wall. One of those shadows belonged to the old wooden coat rack that stood just outside my door. It was a clunky, old-fashioned thing my mom had found at a flea market with 4 curved arms at the top. In the dim light, its shadow was a strange, spidery silhouette splayed against the beige wallpaper, a familiar, harmless landmark in the nightly landscape of my home. I was deep in concentration, trying to string together a coherent thought about 18th century literature, when a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision broke my focus. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I glanced towards the hallway. Nothing. Just the spidery shadow of the coat rack, perfectly still. The house was silent. I shook my head, blaming fatigue. My eyes were playing tricks on me, a common side effect of staring at a bright screen in a dark room for hours. I went back to my paper, but the spell of concentration was broken. A subtle thread of unease had been pulled. The silence of the house no longer felt peaceful, it felt watchful. Every creak of the old house settling, every sigh of the wind outside, now seemed deliberate, meaningful. I tried to ignore it, typing a few more sentences, but my attention kept drifting back to the open doorway, to the darkness that lay beyond the small bubble of my lamplight. Then I heard it, a sound from downstairs. It was a faint, dry, scraping noise. Scry-ape, pause a scry-ape. It sounded like someone dragging a piece of cardboard across a wooden floor. My heart gave a little jump. I took off my headphones and listened, holding my breath. The house was dead quiet. Maybe it was the furnace, or the refrigerator's ice maker. I tried to find a logical anchor, but the sound had been too distinct, too intentional. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and thin in the vast quiet. No response. Of course not. Who would be there? I was alone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I got up, my chair groaning in protest, and walked to the top of the stairs. I peered down into the inky blackness of the first floor. Anyone there? I called again, a little louder this time. Only silence answered. The scraping sound was gone. I stood there for a full minute, my ears straining, but there was nothing. I flipped on the hallway light, flooding the upstairs with a harsh, sterile brightness. The familiar hallway looked perfectly normal. The coat rack stood there, solid and mundane. Its shadow, now sharp and defined under the bright overhead light, was exactly where it should be. Feeling a bit foolish, I switched the light off and went back into my room, leaving the door slightly ajar as it was before. The warm, comforting glow of my desk lamp felt a little safer now. I sat back down, determined to finish my work, but my eyes were now fixed on the hallway. I watched the shadow of the coat rack, waiting for it to do something, even though I knew it was absurd. It was just a shadow. It stayed perfectly still, and yet something about it felt wrong. It seemed darker than I remembered, the edges sharper, as if it were a hole cut out of the light, rather than a mere absence of it. I decided to try a little experiment, just to put my mind at ease. I reached over and shifted my desk lamp, moving it a few inches to the right. The shadows in my room dutifully shifted. The shadow of my monitor stretched and moved. The shadow of the books on my desk slid across the wall. Everything behaved exactly as it should, except for one thing, the shadow of the coat rack. It moved, yes, but it was delayed. For a split second, a barely perceptible moment, after all the other shadows had shifted, the coat rack's shadow remained in its original position before snapping to its new one. It was a tiny, fractional lag, something you would never notice if you weren't looking for it. But I was looking, and I saw it. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, started to creep up my spine. That wasn't possible. A shadow isn't an object. It has no will, no latency. It is a direct, instantaneous consequence of light and obstruction. I tried it again, moving the lamp to the left. Again, the same result. All the shadows moved in perfect unison except for that one. It lingered for a heartbeat before reluctantly following. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away now. I just stared at the coat rack and its shadow, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The spidery silhouette on the wall was no longer a familiar landmark. It was an anomaly, a violation, and then it got worse. As I watched, mesmerized by a mixture of terror and disbelief, the shadow began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it started to stretch. The arms of the shadow elongated, creeping up the wall like dark, spindly fingers. The base of the shadow thickened, spreading across the floorboards like a pool of ink. The coat rack itself hadn't moved an inch. My lamp was perfectly still. Yet its shadow was moving, distorting, behaving with a life of its own. I was frozen in my chair, my body rigid with a primal fear I had never known. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't my tired mind playing games. This was real, and it was happening right in front of me. The climax of the horror came with a quiet, deliberate motion that will be burned into my memory forever. The base of the shadow, the part that should have been anchored to the feet of the coat rack, began to peel away from the wall. It lifted not like a shadow, but like a piece of thin, black fabric being carefully unstuck from a surface. It separated from the object that was supposed to be casting it. The shadow was now detached. It was a free-standing, two-dimensional silhouette of the coat rack, and it began to move. It didn't float or fly. It dragged itself along the floor, a patch of absolute, featureless blackness pulling itself forward, with a horrifying, silent purpose. I could see the texture of the wooden floorboards right through it, yet it was undeniably on top of them, a creeping stain of wrongness. It moved towards my open bedroom door. The sight broke my paralysis. A strangled gasp escaped my lips, and I scrambled backward in my chair, which toppled over with a loud crash. I walked away from the door, my eyes wide with terror, watching as the flat, dark shape slid silently across the hallway carpet and reached the threshold of my room. It had no face, no eyes, no physical form, but I felt its attention on me, a cold, dead, ancient focus. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for my bedroom door, slamming it shut with all my might. The latch clicked just as the shadow reached it. And then I heard the sound again, the same sound from downstairs, but now it was right here, on the other side of the door. Scray-ape, scry-ape. It was the sound of something flat, dry, and weightless dragging itself against the bottom of my door. It was trying to get in. I threw my entire body against the door, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. I fumbled for the lock and turned it. Tears were streaming down my face. I could still hear the faint, persistent scraping. It went on for what felt like an eternity. I dragged my heavy desk, my bookcase, anything I could move, and barricaded the door. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the far corner of my room, wrapped in my duvet, listening. The scraping sound finally stopped after an hour or so, but I didn't dare move until the first rays of morning sun streamed through my window, bright and blessedly normal. When the sun was fully up, I cautiously removed the barricade and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The sun was pouring through the landing window, filling the space with light. The old wooden coat rack stood there, exactly where it had been, and at its base a perfectly ordinary, completely harmless shadow stretched across the floor, exactly where it should be. I never told my parents. I never told anyone. How could I explain it without sounding insane? But that night changed me. I can no longer sleep with my bedroom door open. I have to have every door in the house closed, and preferably locked. I'm deeply uncomfortable in rooms with dim, single, source lighting that casts long, complex shadows, because sometimes when I'm alone, out of the corner of my eye, I see a shadow that seems just a little too dark, a little too sharp, and I feel that old, cold dread rise in my throat, and I remember the night the shadow on the wall decided to move. The night was thick and inky, the kind of darkness that presses in on you, especially when you're out on the back roads of rural Louisiana. It was a muggy, humid night, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth, distant swamp gas, and the sweet, cloying perfume of night, blooming jasmine. I was on my way home from a late shift at the hospital, a good hour's drive from the city. The radio was playing a bluesy, mournful tune, just loud enough to keep me company. It was around 1:30 a.m. These roads were familiar to me, winding through fields of sugarcane and dense cypress swamps. There were no streetlights, just the occasional reflective signpost, or a brief flicker of light from a distant farmhouse. My headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the narrow stretch of asphalt and the dense, shadowy walls of vegetation on either side. The constant chorus of crickets and unseen swamp creatures filled the silence, a symphony of the night. I was feeling particularly drained. It had been a rough shift, a couple of emergencies, a lot of stress. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and fall into bed. My eyes felt heavy, but I was close enough that I knew I could make it. I rolled down my window a crack, letting in the warm, humid air, hoping the freshness would help keep me alert. The smell of the swamp was stronger now, a wild, untamed scent. Ahead I saw the familiar junction, a four-way stop in the middle of nowhere. It was notorious locally for being a bit spooky, mostly because of its isolation and the gnarled, ancient oak tree that stood directly in the center of the crossroads, its moss-draped branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Locals said it was a hanging tree, though no one ever seemed to have proof. Still, the stories made it feel heavy, especially at night. As my car approached the intersection, my headlights swept across the area. That's when I saw it. Standing directly under the thickest, lowest branch of the ancient oak tree was a figure. It was a shadow, a human-shaped shadow, but it was too black, too absolute. It didn't look like a person standing there in the dark. It looked like a hole in the fabric of the night, a silhouette carved out of the surrounding blackness, somehow darker than everything else around it. It was tall, impossibly tall, and slender, with an almost exaggerated narrowness. It had no discernible features, just an outline, a void. My foot instinctively went for the brake, slowing my car almost to a halt. My heart leaped into my throat. What was that? A prank? Some kids out doing something stupid. But there were no other cars, no other sounds, no signs of anyone else. And this shadow was utterly motionless. It stood there, perfectly still, facing directly towards my car. It wasn't looking at me with eyes. It was looking at me with its entire absence. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. This wasn't a person. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was something else. I rolled up my window slowly, my eyes glued to the figure. It didn't react. Not even a twitch. It just stood there, a sentinel of pure darkness under the ancient tree. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A scarecrow. A strange piece of art. But the way it absorbed the light, the way it felt like a hungry void, dispelled all rational thoughts. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands on the steering wheel. I told myself to just drive through the intersection, treat it like a normal stop sign, and get out of there. My car slowly crept forward. As I began to turn left, navigating around the ancient oak, my headlights swept across the shadow figure once more. And this time it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It simply turned. Smoothly, silently, its entire body pivoted, keeping its form always directly facing my car, as if it had no joints, no effort. Just a seamless, impossible rotation. It was still staring at me, still a perfect, featureless black void. But now it was facing me as I moved, tracking me with an unseen gaze. Panic flared through me. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator. I wanted to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But as I cleared the intersection and started down the next stretch of road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. It was still there. Only now, it wasn't under the tree. It was standing in the middle of the crossroads, still perfectly dark, still facing my car, which was now speeding away. It had moved. It had followed me with its gaze, and now it had moved to the very center of the intersection, as if marking its territory, or perhaps just making sure I knew it was watching. I kept driving faster now, my heart a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see it gone, but it wasn't. For what felt like an eternity, as I sped down that lonely road, the dark, slender figure remained visible in my rearview mirror. It seemed to shrink with distance, becoming a tiny pinprick of absolute blackness. But it was always there, always in the center of the crossroads, always facing me. It was like it was burned into my vision, even when the road curved, and I should have lost sight of the intersection. I could still see that impossible shadow, a persistent stain on the retreating darkness. It only disappeared when I finally hit the outskirts of my small town, when the first faint glow of streetlights appeared on the horizon. As my car passed under the reassuring yellow light of a solitary street lamp, I looked in the mirror one last time. Nothing. Just the empty, dark road behind me. I drove straight home, practically flew inside, and locked every door and window. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I sat up, lights blazing, clutching a mug of cold tea, staring out the windows at the normal, harmless shadows cast by my own house. I never told anyone what I saw. How could I? They'd dismiss it as fatigue, as my imagination playing tricks. But I know what I saw. I know that shadow was real, and it was wrong. I still drive those roads for work, but never after midnight if I can help it. And when I approach that particular crossroads, no matter the time of day, I feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I glance at the ancient oak tree, and sometimes, even in broad daylight, a strange, profound darkness seems to cling to the area under its lowest branch, a shadow deeper than any other. I always speed up when I pass that spot. Always. Because some shadows, once they've shown you their true nature, you can never unsee. The old house had always had a certain weight to it. Not a bad weight, necessarily, just a presence. It was my grandmother's house, nestled deep in the woods of rural Vermont. Surrounded by towering pines and ancient maples, it felt like a place outside of time. Built in the late 1800s, with creaking floorboards, narrow staircases, and rooms that always seemed a little too dim, even on the brightest days. I loved visiting, especially in the autumn, when the air was crisp with the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke. This particular autumn, I was staying there alone. My grandmother had gone to visit a sister upstate for a few weeks, and I, a college student on break, had offered to house, sit, water the plants, and make sure everything was okay. It sounded like a peaceful escape from dorm life. It was for the first few days. The silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets at night or the rustling of leaves in the wind. The smell of old wood, dust, and dried flowers filled the air, a comforting, nostalgic scent. My bedroom was on the second floor, at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The hallway itself was always dark. There was a small, dusty window at the far end, but the dense trees outside cast it in perpetual gloom. At night, it was a tunnel of absolute blackness once the lights were off. One night around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Not from a dream, not from a sound, but from that unsettling feeling that someone was watching you. You know the one. That primal sense of being observed, a prickling on the back of your neck. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I lay in bed for a long moment, trying to rationalize it away. Just the house settling, a branch tapping against the window. My imagination. But the feeling persisted, strong and undeniable. I slowly, carefully opened my eyes. My room was dark, but not completely black. A sliver of moonlight, filtered through the thick canopy of trees, managed to sneak in through a gap in the curtains, casting a faint, silvery glow on the worn rug. Enough light to see the familiar shapes of my grandmother's antique furniture. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room. Nothing. My eyes drifted towards the open bedroom door. And that's when I saw it. At the very end of the long, dark hallway, where the window was, there was a shadow. But it wasn't just a shadow. It was a deeper black than the rest of the hallway, a concentration of darkness that seemed to have form. It stood perfectly still, perfectly upright, like a tall, thin figure. It was too tall to be a person, too thin to be anything natural. It was just a column of absolute blackness, darker than the night outside, darker than anything I had ever seen. My breath hitched. My entire body went cold and hot with a jolt of adrenaline. My mind screamed, "What is that?" But no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at that thing, that shadow that shouldn't have been there. It didn't move. It just stood there perfectly still at the end of the hallway, facing my door, even though it had no discernible features, no eyes, no face, no limbs that I could clearly make out. I knew, deep down, that it was looking at me. I could feel its gaze, a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to pin me to my bed. Minutes stretched into an eternity. My eyes started to burn, but I couldn't tear them away. I was trapped, locked in a silent staring contest with a void. My rational mind tried to find an explanation. A coat hanging on a hook, a trick of the moonlight. But no, this was too solid, too uniform, too wrong. It wasn't just a patch of darkness, it was a presence. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't glide. It seemed to shift. It leaned. Just a slight tilt, as if observing me more closely, or perhaps just stretching. It was a movement that defied physics, a silent, fluid motion that sent another wave of terror through me. My heart now hammered a frantic rhythm, threatening to burst from my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to make it disappear. It's not real. It's not real. It's a dream. I chanted it in my head over and over until my temples throbbed. I kept my eyes shut for what felt like ages, counting to 100, then 200. I gripped the covers so tightly my knuckles turned white. Finally, with a burst of courage fueled by desperation, I forced my eyes open. It was still there, but it was closer. It had moved down the hallway, perhaps a foot or two, towards my door. It was still the same towering, absolute blackness, but now it felt even more menacing, even more immediate. The distance between us had shrunk, and with it, my remaining shred of composure. A whimper escaped my lips. I clamped my hand over my mouth, terrified of making any more noise. What if it heard me? What if it decided to come closer? What if it came into my room? The thought was unbearable. I pulled the covers up to my chin, burying myself as much as possible, leaving only my eyes exposed. I stared at the thing, mesmerized by fear. I could feel tears starting to prick at the corners of my eyes, hot and stinging. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was utterly, completely helpless. Then a distant sound. The faint crow of a rooster from a neighboring farm. It was barely audible, but it was there. And as if on cue, as if the first hint of morning had broken some invisible spell, the shadow at the end of the hallway began to change. It didn't vanish instantly. Instead, it seemed to unravel. The solid blackness began to fray at the edges, becoming less defined, less absolute. It thinned like smoke dissipating. The towering form slowly, painstakingly lost its coherence. It faded, blending back into the general darkness of the hallway, becoming just a shadow once more, indistinguishable from the other patches of gloom. By the time the first real light of dawn, a weak, pale gray, filtered through the small window at the end of the hallway, the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty. Just the old wallpaper, the dusty baseboards, the familiar worn carpet. I lay there for a long time, trembling, until the sun was fully up and streaming through my bedroom window, warm and bright and gloriously normal. I didn't sleep again that night. I got up, made a pot of coffee, and sat in the kitchen, staring out at the woods, trying to convince myself it had all been a nightmare. But it hadn't been. I knew it. That shadow, that watcher, had been real. I never stayed in that house alone again. I told my grandmother about it, vaguely attributing it to a bad dream. She just nodded, a knowing look in her eyes, and said, "The old house has its secrets, child. Best not to stir them." I didn't push it. I didn't want to know more. Some shadows, once seen, are best left undisturbed. I still get that prickling feeling when I'm alone in a long, dark hallway, and I always make sure to turn on every light.